Thanks for joining us on Planet America. I'm John Barron.
Hey, I'm Chaz Ciccitello.
This week, a court finds embryos are humans, throwing IVF treatments into doubt.
And mobile phone records have thrown Trump's Georgia election rigging case into doubt. There's so much doubt. But first...
Former President Donald Trump took another stride towards the Republican Party nomination this week, beating his main rival, Nikki Haley, in her home state of South Carolina by just over 20 points. Trump said it was
an even bigger win than we anticipated, and I was just informed that we got double the number of votes that has ever been received in the great state of South Carolina.
And that is actually true. Yet, despite the loss, Haley says she's going to continue the fight for one simple reason.
I don't believe Donald Trump can beat Joe Biden. Nearly every day, Trump drives people away.
But Nikki Haley has also driven some very important people away. Her major donors, Americans for Prosperity, the conservative group linked to billionaire Charles Koch, announcing that they were turning off Haley's money tap, telling staff in an email, given the challenges in the primary states ahead, we don't believe any outside group can make a material difference to widen Haley's path to victory. They also had this swipe at Donald Trump, claiming if he is the nominee, there is, quote, the risk of one party rule by the Democratic Party, warning voters have consistently rejected Donald Trump and his impact on the Republican Party brand, and they expect this to increase further as the criminal trials progress, Chaz.
Now, that claim that you played before from Trump may well have been true, but not everything he said was true.
Really?
Yes, this not so much.
There's never been a spirit like this, and I just want to say that I have never seen the Republican Party so unified as it is right now.
Never so unified. He didn't even win 60% of the vote. Now, admittedly, this was Nikki Haley's home state. In the past, even complete failures have managed to win their home state. But Haley still represents a fair amount of Trump resistance voting in the primary. About 1/3 of South Carolina primary voters said they would not consider Trump fit for the presidency if he was convicted of a crime, including a quarter of self-identified Republicans and including more than 80% of Nikki Haley voters. Haley had pretty much the same pockets of strength, in fact, that she's had for the entire primary season. She won 54% of college graduates, for example. She won 55% of people who are not white evangelicals. And she won 54% of independents, although Trump did win a massive 73% of Republicans in the Republican primary. Interestingly, independents only made up 21% of this primary, which is entirely standard for South Carolina. So that suggests that there was no groundswell of independent and Democratic support turning out for Nikki Haley in the end. Now, Democrats might be looking at those underwhelming numbers for Trump, who is effectively an incumbent for Republicans, and they might compare them to similarly underwhelming primary performances from Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush in the past. They went on to lose their general elections after such performances, but importantly, in their cases, when people wanted change, they had to vote for the other guy. Whereas in this case, when only 24% of people are saying the country is heading in the right direction, well, they can vote for Trump, not the other guy. So that's quite a big difference. But what about electability? We're still, even now, seeing the odd general election poll where Haley has a massive result. Like, for instance, the latest Marquette poll has Trump beating Biden 51-49, 2 points. But Haley is beating Biden by 16 points, 58-42. Well, Republicans disagree with our electability theory. At least they did in South Carolina, with 81% of them saying that Trump is likely to beat Biden, compared to only 59% of them saying Haley is likely to beat Biden. And you know, they might be right. Look at the latest Quinnipiac poll. Biden is beating Trump by 4 points in a head-to-head contest. But when you add the third-party candidates into the poll, Biden is only beating Trump by 1 point, with Kennedy winning 15% support. Okay, fine. Let's try the same thing with Haley. When she and Biden are head-to-head, Haley wins by 3 points, doing better than Trump. But When you add in all the third-party candidates, Biden then is beating Haley by a whopping 8 points, with Kennedy winning 24% support. So what's going on there? Why is Haley doing so much worse when independents are thrown into the mix? Well, here are the basic numbers. Now, when we divide them by party, you can see Haley only wins 56% of the Republican vote, whereas Kennedy wins 30% of Republicans. Also, Haley only wins 22% of independents, Kennedy wins 37% of them. So in other words, at least according to that poll, Haley is not actually more electable than Trump, because Republicans and independents only pick her when they have no other non-Biden options, whereas Trump support is locked in, no matter who he's running against. And in the real world, there will be other candidates. So Trump's steadiness is his superpower.
So it seems. Meanwhile, the former president spent part of South Carolina's primary election day at the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, at the Gaylord Convention Centre in Maryland, where he began by getting rather too familiar with the American flag. Then he gave a long, and I mean long, speech. For context, the last pre-Trump Republican presidential nominee to address CPAC was Mitt Romney in 2012, and he spoke for a rather restrained 26 minutes.
And God bless America.
Well, Donald Trump riffed, kibitzed and griped for almost exactly an hour longer than Mitt did, and it was hard to tell what was weirder, Trump's script or his ad-libs.
Crooked Joe and his henchmen have you trapped, and it's an express train barreling toward servitude and to ruin. It's moving at a speed that Joe doesn't understand, because Joe actually, I don't think he knows what the hell's going on, to be honest with you, but he's surrounded by some very bad fascists.
Bad fascists. Not as good as good fascists. Interestingly, given some Trump staffers see that California Governor Gavin Newsom is their hardest to beat alternatives to Biden, Trump wrapped up by attacking Newsom over the issue of water.
It comes down the artificial veins and the natural veins where the water poured down. They take this water and they send it out to the Pacific, way above California. They send the water out to the Pacific to protect a little tiny fish that's not doing too well anyway.
OK, a quick fact check on that, leaving aside the artificial veins of water. Experts scoff at Trump's claim that too much fresh water is being sent out to sea off California, pointing out that if they didn't allow fresh water to flow down the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, it would become salt water, which would be unfit to drink and unfit to irrigate crops with. But, I don't know, maybe put some disinfectant in there. Meanwhile, back at CPAC, there was a straw poll to see who should be the Republican nominee. Not surprisingly, Donald Trump won that very easily. Trump has also had another very comfortable win in today's Michigan primary. And there's a lot of interest as well in that uncommitted vote in the Democratic primary as a measure of Arab American discontent with Joe Biden's support for Israel. It's probably no coincidence that Biden's been talking up the prospects of a ceasefire in recent days. Activists had set an uncommitted target of 10%. So they're exceeding their own expectations, I guess. Next week, the primaries are coming thick and fast. On Saturday, there is another Republican vote in Michigan at congressional district caucus meetings, which will actually decide the majority of delegates, because the Michigan Republican Party is basically split in half. There are also Republican caucuses in Idaho and Missouri as well. In Washington, D.C., there's a Republican primary on Sunday. North Dakota Republicans vote on Monday. And next Tuesday, the 5th of March, is Super Tuesday, when both Democrats and Republicans vote in Alabama, Republicans in Alaska, both in Arkansas, California and Colorado. We'll finally get results from the Iowa Democratic Postal Caucus. Both parties are voting on Tuesday in Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, Virginia and, not forgetting, American Samoa.
Election 2024. What's at stake?
These are the stakes of this election. Our country is being destroyed, and the only thing standing between you and its obliteration is me.
The issue of abortion is once again front and centre of the 2024 US election campaign, following a ruling in the Alabama State Supreme Court. Some legal experts have described this decision as bizarre. The court determined the state's Wrongful Death of a Minor Act applies to all unborn children, regardless of their location. And that location includes what it calls extrauterine children, by which they mean unborn children who are located outside of a biological uterus at the time they are killed, by which they mean an embryo in a test tube. So killing a fertilised embryo a few days old, which has been cryogenically frozen, is now legally the same thing in the state of Alabama as killing an 18-year-old person. The judgment notes that unborn children have been widely recognised as living persons with rights and interests, citing the landmark Dobbs v Jackson's women's health case, which effectively overturned abortion rights recognised under Roe v Wade in 1973. So IVF providers suddenly had to figure out what treating an embryo the same as somebody who's been allowed to drive for 3 years means, so they simply stopped.
And just days after the state Supreme Court's ruling, almost half of Alabama's fertility clinics are pausing IVF treatments.
And the political reaction was just as immediate.
On the campaign trail in Michigan, Vice President Kamala Harris saying we're at this point because of President Trump appointing Supreme Court justices who would overturn Roe.
And he did it. And that's what got us to this point today.
But former President Trump wanted to make something very clear.
I strongly support the availability of IVF for couples who are trying to have a precious little beautiful baby. I support it.
And Trump then called on legislators in Alabama to change the law to guarantee IVF services. But his Republican rival Nikki Haley was not making anything clear. Asked if she agreed with the Alabama court that embryos created during IVF are children, she said,
I mean, embryos to me are babies.
And
When you talk about an embryo, you are talking about, to me, that's a life. And so I do see where that's coming from when they talk about that.
now, Chaz, to many people, that sounded like she agreed with the Alabama ruling.
I didn't say that I agreed with the Alabama ruling. What the question that I was asked is, do I believe an embryo is a baby? I do think that if you look in the definition, an embryo is considered an unborn baby. And so, yes, I believe from my stance that that is.
OK, so she did not agree with the Alabama ruling, except when she did. But she says people are just confused about this case.
This case was based on, and should be based on, the rights of those parents for their embryos, and to make sure that they have the responsibility with the doctors on how those are handled. Nothing more than that.
Compare that verbal and logical tangle to Trump's message.
We want to make it easier for mothers and fathers to have babies, not harder. You know that.
And right there probably explains why Donald Trump is beating Nikki Haley.
Yeah, this is the perfect issue for Trump's style. Don't try and be intellectually consistent. Just state your message, your populist message, bang, bang, bang.
Yep, no need to get into the detail.
Totally. Look, I do actually have sympathy for Republicans in this case. It is tough to be consistent while staying both pro-life and pro-IVF, as demonstrated by Senator Tommy Tuberville, who was struggling to remain consistent for one sentence.
Do you have a reaction to the Alabama Supreme Court ruling on the fact that embryos are children?
Yeah, I was all for it. You know, you just got to look at everything going on in the country. It's just an attack on families, attack on kids. You know, anything that we can do for the future of our young people, because they're our number one commodity. We need to have more kids. We need to have an opportunity to do that. And I thought this was the right thing to do. But
IVF is used to have more children, and right now IVF services are paused at some of the clinics in Alabama. Aren't you concerned that this could impact people who are trying to have kids?
Well, that's for another conversation. I think the big thing is right now you go back to the situation and try to work it out to where it's best for everybody. I mean, that's what the whole abortion issue is about. So
but this really isn't about abortion. It's about IVF and the concern that now families might not have access to it.
But it's about the same direction, but I agree. You know, I'd have to look at the entire bill and how it's written. I have not seen it.
Supreme Court decision.
Well, I know that.
I'm not sure you do know that, Tommy.
Yeah, I think that's one of those examples where a politician just say, sorry, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, he certainly didn't know what he was talking about. And look, if people think it's unfair to ambush Senator Tommy Tuberville with these Alabama Supreme Court issues, He is the senator for Alabama.
Yeah.
So he should know about that. Anyway, no wonder he was nervous. The polling on this issue is dire for pro-lifers. Trump's ex-spin master, Kellyanne Conway, she's returned to polling, and she found back in December that 86% of people support IVF access, including 78% of self-identified pro-life advocates and 83% of evangelical Christians. The politics of this are so straightforward. Even Kamala Harris is hitting it out of the park.
So on the one hand, the proponents are saying that an individual doesn't have a right to end an unwanted pregnancy. And on the other hand, the individual does not have a right to start a family.
It's a good idea for Biden to get her out on the abortion beat, by the way. Not only is she obviously a woman, which helps, but also it will help her build a support base on an easy issue for Democrats. She needs to build that support base. But here is Republicans' biggest problem. Even though they know that IVF is extremely popular, it simply contradicts one of their most commonly held ideologies. 125 of them co-sponsored the Life at Conception Act last year, within which they defined human beings as including all stages of life, including the moment of fertilization, cloning, or other moment at which an individual member of the human species comes into being. Now, if that sounds broad, it's intentional. There is no exception for IVF in the bill. And if you think that's an accident, it is not. There used to be an exception in the previous version of the bill in 2017, and they got rid of it. Either you believe the fertilized egg is a human being or you don't. Right now, they're trying to believe both.
Tricky.
So, even though you can expect IVF to be looked after, I think, because of the polling, Republicans have now got a problem. And those 125 co-sponsors of that bill before can expect some attack ads to be coming their way big time in a few months, I think, John.
Yeah, I think you're right. Joining us now is Seema Mohapatra. She's an expert in assisted reproduction and bioethics, also a law professor at USM Dedman School of Law in the state of Texas. Professor, welcome to Planet America.
Thanks for having me.
So in your view, did these IVF clinics in Alabama have any option but to suspend their operations? What sort of legal risks would they have been facing?
So nothing in the opinion last week said that IVF was banned in Alabama, but it makes sense why they paused to see what their legal risks would be, because in the course of IVF, even without frozen embryos can be destroyed. And so they are probably looking at what kind of risk they face in terms of tort liability if there is any kind of embryo destruction as they are going through an IVF cycle. And so it's just going to make IVF more expensive and also possibly less likely to result in a live birth.
Now, Kamala Harris blamed the Roe versus Wade repeal, but there have been heaps of laws around the country, including this one, that did treat fetuses or embryos like children before Roe versus Wade were repealed, weren't there? So couldn't this ruling have happened before Roe versus Wade was repealed?
Absolutely. So this actually is not related to Dobbs, because the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act, even before Dobbs, the Alabama Supreme Court had before found that a in utero fetus could be considered a child for the wrongful death of a minor act. And so this had nothing to do with Dobbs. And actually, the pre-Dobbs abortion rules in Alabama make clear that it has to be in utero. And so the abortion law is actually more, it exempts IVF because the legislators wanted to exempt IVF compared to the decision here, which includes IVF and was a very kind of surprising decision for even the legislators that, did not have this in mind. This statute, is hundreds of years old and obviously was written way before IVF. And so the fact that this was considered to be including basically what the judge said was extrauterine children. So the fact that, 8-cell embryos were considered minor children was kind of surprising to everyone.
Professor, in your view, why was this brought as a wrongful death case rather than a simple negligence for compensation civil case? Was this, in fact, designed to test the notion of embryonic or fetal personhood?
It wasn't. And so they actually did bring a straight negligence case, a medical malpractice type case. And that was not what was appealed here. This was basically a wrongful death, but also a civil liability case. And if you think about who brought the case, 3 couples who lost some frozen embryos when a patient got into them, they all have interest in continuing their IVF journey if they want to have additional children. And so this was not really brought for that purpose. However, it was brought for compensation purposes, because if you have an embryo that is considered a minor child, you are going to have more damages compared to if it is frozen genetic material. And so that potential life part means that you would get compensated more. So this was a civil wrong type of case, but in the United States, all wrongful death cases are under statutory schemes.
Given that some people, mostly Democrats, want to firmly link IVF to the right to access an abortion, while others, pro-life Americans, tend to want to separate the issues very definitely, how do you think this is going to play out in this election year?
Former President Trump released a statement last week making clear that IVF should be protected, which would be the same kind of feeling that President Biden has. And so in terms of IVF, I don't think that's going to be a hot rod issue. Abortion, however, is going to be a hot rod issue in terms of for the Democrats trying to drive people to the poll and say, look what happened. And if you vote for, Democrats, they can try to, stall some of these. And then for Republicans saying, look, we have this court that is extremely conservative and we're going to continue that conservative majority if you vote for Republicans. So I think that is going to be a huge issue. And I think in a way, both sides want that to be an issue to drive people to the polls.
Professor Seema Mohapatra, thanks for being with us on Planet America.
Thank you so much.
Election 2024. What's at stake?
A vote for Trump is your ticket back to freedom. It's your passport out of tyranny. And it's your only escape from Joe Biden and his gang's fast track to hell.
We told you last week about how there are some question marks over the district attorney who is indicting Trump in Georgia, Fani Willis. In particular, whether she had a conflict of interest that was unfairly disadvantaging Trump and his fellow defendants when Willis began an affair with the chief prosecutor that she hired, Nathan Wade. Now, last week we told you there didn't appear to be a huge amount to the allegations of a conflict of interest, even though Willis and Wade did admit to having the affair. They both testified it began in 2022 after Willis hired Wade in November 2021. But there was one part of the hearing that has since become much more significant.
Do you think prior to November 1st of 2021, you were at the condo more than 10 times?
No, sir.
So it would be less than 10 times?
Yes, sir.
So if phone records were to reflect that you were making phone calls from the same location as the condo before November 1st of 2021, and it was on multiple occasions, the phone records would be wrong?
If phone records reflected that, yes, sir.
They'd be wrong?
They'd be wrong.
Okay.
The condo there being Fani Willis's condo they're talking about. Nathan Wade denying they spent a lot of time at that condo, less than 10 times before he was hired. Now, the reason the lawyer was asking about hypothetical phone records to a condo was because the lawyer had already subpoenaed Wade's phone records, and now we know the results. Using Wade's cell phone data, we now know that Wade was indeed in the vicinity of where Willis lives for an extended period 35 times in 2021 before Willis hired him. And 2 of those occasions were late at night. Now, importantly, this proves nothing. The investigator has isolated 2 cell phone towers near Willis's home, one which is about 600 metres away, the other about 900 metres away, but also covered by the same signals. would be several nearby restaurants and a number of hotels. This does not show that Wade actually visited Willis's condo, or in fact, that she was even at her condo if he visited it. At best, it shows he was in the area. He may not have even been standing still. He could have been walking or driving around. Furthermore, Willis's colleagues say it was not uncommon for Willis to hold work meetings at her condo. And even though Wade wasn't at that stage working for her, he was part of her kitchen cabinet at the time, so there was a reason for him to be there. But having said all that, investigators also logged over 2,000 voice calls and 12,000 interactions. Take away the phone calls, that means 10,000 text messages between the two of them just in the first 11 months of 2021. That is over 6 phone calls a day and about 30 text messages a day before they were supposedly going out or officially working together. And look what happens when you combine those texts and phone calls with the location data. Here are 2 examples. One night, Wade left the area of his house at 10:15 p.m. and he turned up in the area of Willis's house at 10:45 p.m. and he stayed there until 3:28 a.m. when he left, arriving back in his home area at 4:05 a.m. and then he texted Fonnie Willis at 4:20 a.m. In the second example, Wade called Fonnie Willis at 11:32 p.m. for 40 minutes. 33 minutes into that phone call, he left the area of his house. Then he called Willis again at 12:38 a.m. and arrived in the area of her condo 5 minutes later at 12:43 a.m. And then he stayed in that area until he left at 4:55 a.m. Now, to me, that all sounds kind of sus, but it very much depends on just how reliable this cell phone evidence is. So we asked former Assistant US Attorney and Appellate Chief for the Southern District of Georgia, Amy-Lee Copeland, just how precise tracking people through cell phone towers actually is.
Well, it depends on which party you ask. The state often uses this kind of data in prosecutions, and they think it's the knit you up, put your client exactly where they want them to be. The defense usually argues that this is a generalized area, that there's a radius, and that the client may or may not have been there, that there are other things certainly in the area. The Fonnie Willis case is kind of the opposite of this. The state says, well, this creates about a 9-mile radius that's full of other locations, other things that Nathan Wade could have been in at any time. Meanwhile, Mr. Trump's team says that, listen, this is something that we have done, that we've identified him pausing at various cell stations. He wasn't in movement. And when he wasn't in movement, he was at least 2 occasions at cell towers, pinging off cell towers 2,000 to 3,000 feet from Miss Willis's home.
Okay, so there may well be an element of doubt, but there's also a circumstantial picture being created here. How persuasive do you think that circumstantial picture would be for a judge?
Well, in this particular case, the circumstantial picture is that there are 2,000 calls over an 11-month period, and nobody has any doubt about those because those are on the records. There are about 10,000 texts in that same 11-month period, and you have 2 people who admit that they have actually been in a relationship. There are questions about when the relationship started, and there are also text messages that appear after Mr. Wade has left the area. They're in the middle of the night. And so they certainly prove that they don't prove they're together, but they are circumstantial evidence that he was at least in that area at the time. But again, whether this is really relevant to the issue of hand, I think is the big question in this particular case.
So do you think at the end of this process, Fonnie Willis will stay on this case? And do you think it will proceed this year?
Those are 2 separate questions. The expectation is that, yes, under Georgia conflict law, she should be able to stay on the case. The second question, whether it will proceed this year, the answer, it could, but there are other factors. The judge may allow an immediate appeal if he determines that she's not disqualified. That could hold things up for at least a 2-month period. I think Ms. Willis had proposed an August 26th trial date in this case, but she had told the judge that she'd be ready to try the case within 30 days, and they were trying to fit it around the other scheduled cases. So best case scenario for the DA's office is that there is a decision within the next few weeks. 60 days pass and no one takes it up on appeal, and then it can begin being tried toward the fall as she had initially hoped.
And that is it for another trip to Planet America. Do join us for the Fireside Chat on ABC News this Friday night.
And don't forget, we're on iView and YouTube by 9 p.m. every Wednesday and Friday, so you don't even have to wait for the telly. And there's a brand new pet podcast out today all about Russia. You can find it there.
Bye-bye.